Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, and I could not be happier about hosting this evening's program. I'll introduce our speakers, Jaime Lowe and Beth Hines, in just a moment, but I have a little bit of other information and some guidance about Crowdcast to share with you before we move on to that. So first of all, thank you again for being here. Please chime in on the chat. Let us know where you're from and anything else you want us to know about you. The chat is a huge add-on for these virtual programs that we've been doing for the past 18 months or so. You're not allowed to chat when you're in an auditorium listening to a speaker, so it's fun to chat during the program here. However, if you do have a question for either of the speakers, particularly Jaime, but Beth is eager to answer questions too, rather than put them in the chat, can I ask you please to put them down in that Ask a Question area that you see at the bottom of your screen. I'll be popping back up toward the end of the program to help with the Q&A, and that will make my life so much easier if you do it that way. So thank you for that in advance. Right above that Ask a Question area, you'll see a long green bar about your donation here will be shared between the Twain House and Community Partners in Action. Community Partners in Action is a wonderful organization. Beth Hines is representing them tonight, and we've done a number of programs with them together, and we'll be talking a little bit more about the work that they do. But if you're able to share anything in the way of a donation tonight, know that both organizations, the Mark Twain House and Museum and Community Partners in Action, will put every single penny to very, very good use, and we'll appreciate every single penny you're able to offer too. Look at all you people chiming in from all over the place. If you were to scroll all the way back up to the top of your chat, which you won't have to do because I'll copy and paste it again, but you'll see a link, an opportunity to purchase tonight's book, Breathing Fire, Female Inmate Firefighters on the Front Lines of California's Wildfires by Jaime Lowe. Now, we know that you can purchase that elsewhere if you need to, but do know that if you make that purchase by clicking the link with us, you get a signed copy, first of all, and also your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. And, you know, COVID has been a challenge for us, and we've been really proud to be able to continue offering these programs throughout COVID. But it's not been super easy financially. We've been without a number of our major revenue streams during this time. So anything you can do in the way of a donation or purchasing the book, again, is a real big boost to us. So thank you in advance for that. So I'm going to introduce our guests and move on. So tonight we'll be talking with Beth Hines, the Executive Director of Community Partners in Action, which was founded in 1875 as the Prisoner's Friend Society, with Mark Twain, our own Mark Twain, as one of their founding benefactors. Community Partners in Action focuses on behavioral change and advocates for criminal justice reform. And they do a lot of great things. And I have to tell you, one of the great things that they do is sponsoring with us the what's supposed to be annual, we missed a year, but we're catching up now, exhibition of prison arts. And so if you were able to get to the Mark Twain House and Museum between now and the end of December, you could see an amazing exhibition of art that was created by incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people. And I just toured it yesterday. I could not get enough. It's amazing. So please come and see that if you are able to do so. We'll be talking tonight also with Jaime Lowe, a writer living in Brooklyn. She's a frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine. Her work has appeared in New York Magazine, Esquire, Sports Illustrated, Maxim, Gawker, The Village Voice, LA Weekly, and on ESPN.com. She's the author of Digging for Dirt, The Life and Death of ODB, which is a biography of Old Dirty Bastard, a founding member of the Wu-Tang Clan. And of course, tonight's book is a great departure from that. So I hope you'll all join me in giving a great big Mark Twain House welcome to Jaime Lowe and Beth Hines. Hello, Jaime.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. And welcome, Beth.
Hi, greetings. How are you?
So good. So happy to have you. So I'm going to disappear and sit back and enjoy your conversation. And Beth, you'll let me know when you want me to come back up and help with the Q&A?
I will. Thanks, Jennifer.
No, thank you. Have fun.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks. Hi, Jaime. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
So nice to have you with us tonight.
Thank you for doing this. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Me too. So congratulations on Breathing Fire, such a thought-provoking book on so many levels. From the deeply personal stories of the imprisoned women on the front lines of tragic wildfires, to the historical injustice that occurs in California prisons, to catastrophic climate change. And somewhat coincidental in that here in the Northeast, we've been monitoring poor air quality for the past several weeks due to fires out west. You know, Jaime, I found your book really hard to put down, but I also found it really hard to read at times, given all that the women endured prior to and after prison. It's reminiscent of what many of our women in prison here in Connecticut face, unfortunately. In Breathing Fire, you describe how many of the women work hard to gain acceptance into the fire camp so they can escape the realities of what goes on in California's prisons. Can you speak more about what the women are trying to get away from, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of being in the fire camp?
Sure. There's something bad is happening with the audio.
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Okay, now it's normal. Sorry, everybody. The first question I'll say, they're trying to escape basically the conditions of county jails and state prisons, which can be appalling, inhumane. They can, go anywhere from sexual assault by correctional officers to predation, to fighting within the communities that exist there, to, malnutrition, to ill health. There are conditions that, there's maybe rats in the food, and some of the women I interviewed, worked in the kitchen because it was a better place to work because you could have access to better meals, but also they knew the insides of how those meals were made and where that food came from and what it looked like. And, most days the bread was moldy. There were conditions that, this has changed, but at LA County for a long time, when you were processed, you basically were lined up in a garage, in a very brutal atmosphere, and strip searched and put through this process that was traumatizing. I mean, just to be processed. And there was a class action lawsuit against the sheriff's department for that, and it's since evolved slightly, but the conditions are still really, really harsh. And so, a lot of people in the corrections department say that the fire program is volunteer and that women are choosing to do it. But in my mind, it's a choice that is to avoid being in these other places. And so it's sort of a lesser of two very difficult choices, because one, while the conditions are way better in the camps, you're putting your life on the line and you're putting your body at risk. You had a second part to your question that I don't remember.
So can you go into more detail about the advantages of being at the fire camp and also the disadvantages? I mean, clearly putting their lives at risk is a major disadvantage, but they also went through really rigorous training, sometimes, grueling, in terms of the hiking with all the gear. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So there are a lot of advantages, actually, and a lot of the women spoke to the advantages. One of the things that when I talked with one of the women last night at a different event, she talked about how when she was visited by her kids in state prison, it was between glass, and she could only put her hand up and her child could only put their hand up. And that was the extent of their touch. And when you're in camp, there's no fence, there's no barbed wire. You have these sort of picnic areas where you can actually visit with your family. Some of them have cabins where you can actually sleep over. And there's actually this humanity that's attached to it. You're in these wooded areas. You're not in what feels like a prison. It looks more like an actual camp, and you're in these hills. The actual work is grueling, but there's something about that almost all the women that I interviewed talked about the purpose, the involvement, the reliance on each other, the sort of sisterhood that was created. One woman referred to her crew as her sister crew. And it always felt like this kind of incredible bond that was created. And of course, that comes with infighting and gossip and all of the things that come with a camp full of women, which was what one of the women said to me. And I, found that to be really interesting too.
Definitely. My next question, has to do more about really the primary character of the book. If you would identify someone as the character, Shauna, the woman who was killed in the when she was fighting the Mulholland fire. I know that you didn't get to meet her, but you were clearly, just from your writing, you were clearly so connected to her life from your interviews with her mother, Diana, and also the women who were incarcerated with her. What was it like to learn about Shauna through the memories of others? Your writing clearly shows a deep connection to her.
Yeah, it's very complicated because I felt like I had to kind of stitch together a person that I would never know, and that in all reality, the version that I stitched together would not be Shauna and would not be the Shauna that people experienced or knew. It would be the version that was, as to the best of my ability, I spent a lot of time with her mom, and I tried to understand Shauna through her mom and through her sister, through her last boyfriend before she went off to prison, through, she left a very pretty detailed Facebook page. And in a lot of ways, it was like a map of some of her emotional ups and downs, and pictures of her at the Trap, which was the bar where her mom was a bartender. And I connect really well with sort of visual residue. And there were these photos that you could really see parts of her character kind of coming out. And I think I would ask about those details to anyone who had known her. And that included people who were with her at camp. And as much, I tried to reach anyone who was willing to talk about her to me. And, that included someone who saw her while she was being transferred from LA County Jail to the Forestry Department. And he happened to also be somebody who was at the Trap a lot. And he was in LA County, and his face was against the wall, and they sort of called out to each other. And so he kind of told me about that moment. And that was such a specific moment. And it eventually was that, one person would lead to the next person, until I could get as full of a picture as possible. I never would be able to say that I have a real understanding of her, but I feel like I wish I did. I mean, she seemed like a pretty incredible and very funny person.
And resilient, for sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. When I finished reading the book, I wanted to just remember more about her. And so I went back to the beginning to read the opening that was really the story of her, just because I wanted to remember more about the details, So.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jaime, why this book? What inspired you to delve into the lives of incarcerated women who are on the front lines of California's wildfires?
So I actually was reading the LA Times. I was home. I think I was at my mom's house, and I had just finished writing an article about mental health, and I think I was looking for another article to focus on, and it was a very short article. It was like a 500-word article, and Shauna's description was of a person who was linked to her crime, and I really first was struck by this sort of lack of information about a full person, and I wanted to know more about her. And then I was struck by, oh my God, what is this program? You know, I am from California. I was born in Oakland. I grew up in LA. I know those hills. I know those hikes. I know that space really well. How did I never know that there were fire camps throughout the state, that this program existed since 1946? You know, what is this? Like, what is this invisible workforce that exists saving our state from what is sure to be, you know, a yearly climate crisis? And not yearly, it's current, it's like all the time. You know, fire season is all the time now. It's 13 months a year, as the great Stephen Pine, I think, once identified. So I felt very connected to it because of my state. And I also felt very, I think what drives my interest in a story is curiosity. And I feel like if I want to know more about it, that's the first step. And then the second step is, you know, is this something that I can actually tell, and why? And I wasn't sure that I could. And I wasn't sure that I could do it in a book form either, or why I would do that. And eventually it felt very, very important to me after I had started the reporting to tell the stories of other women, and that, you know, Shauna lost her life and she deserved to have her story told and her person known, but that there were all these other women, you know, thousands of women who had gone through the program, and they deserve that too. You know, they deserve that kind of recognition.
Jaime, I think it would be helpful to give the audience just a backstory in terms of, so the women get to the fire camp. When a fire happens, what is the expectation of them?
Oh, so the expectation is exactly the same as a hand crew. You know, it depends on the fire. It depends on what stage it's at. It depends how far away it is from their camp. You know, with the Mulholland fire where Shauna Jones passed away, they were the first crew to respond because their camp was the closest. And so their crew had been called on like 3 or 4 different fires that night. They all were false alarms. They thought they weren't going out. They were going to be off their shift. They all had gone to bed, and then they got called out. They were the first crew there. There were active flames, and they had to cut fire lines. So they had to actually go into these mountains, which, if you don't know Santa Monica Mountains and the Malibu Mountains, they are, you know, treacherous. They're really steep. They're rocky. They're sandy. They are, you know, they're undeveloped. They're not the Malibu of reality shows. There aren't these huge mansions always. And so they were actually, you know, doing these really tough climbs up and down, trying to get to the area where they needed to create the containment line. So they do a lot of the way that the crew works. There are 2 chainsaws and a bucker for each chainsaw. And so there's 2 sort of sets that start the crew. And then there is the rest of the crew, about 10 other women who all have kind of gardening tools to a certain extent, Pulowskis, McLeods, other ones that I'm forgetting, sorry. But they essentially hack away at the growth, and then the rest of the crew will dig away the roots, and anything that could potentially be set on fire, they remove all of that growth. And so they try and create this line so that the fire can't jump the line and doesn't spread further.
Such an important piece. And if I recall correctly from your book, women are better at this particular job when fighting fires than men. They're more precise with the cutting.
That's what all the foremen and the captains told me.
So, just in terms of, you heard some really difficult things to hear in your interviews with the women. And I'm just curious as to, how did you cope with all that you learned about, how the women were exploited, whether it be by the prison staff or that the women on the front lines of the fires were unable to work in this field when they were released from prison and on parole. And it just seemed, strange to me because, California is literally on fire.
So how did I cope with hearing it, or?
Yeah, how did you cope with, because those things can be really difficult to hear.
Yeah, they were. I think in several ways, one was that every time I heard it, it reminded me how important it was to actually do the book and tell the story and keep going with it, because I felt so affected by it and like I needed to do it. And it felt like, it felt important, both emotionally and as work. I think also, so one thing that wasn't mentioned in my bio is that I had written a book called Mental, which was about being bipolar, and I've just had a lot of therapy. I don't know that I think that that's helped a lot, but I think it is really hard to, to keep a lot of these stories, but I think that it's kind of the only thing I want to do. And I always know that I'm really lucky that I get to talk to people about their stories and that they're willing to share them. And, my hearing them is not nearly as difficult or impactful as actually experiencing them. And so it's not quite the same, and I don't want to get into like comparing it, but it's sort of like, I feel like people go through a lot, and I don't know that I feel privileged to be able to hear their stories.
Part of what, frustrated me was when some of the women in your book were out of prison and they wanted to go into forestry or they wanted to become an EMT, having done the work while they were at the fire camp. And, due to licensing restrictions, or parole restrictions, they were unable to get into that work after being trained at the fire camp and doing it for, even years at a time. And so, how did that make you feel? What did you think about that?
I think it's one of the most complicated and worst parts of the program. And I think that it's the state of California is trying to evolve. They've passed a bill called AB 2147, which is helping to expedite expungements for formerly incarcerated firefighters. I think that's a step in the right direction, but there's a long way to go with it. I think that it is certainly enraging that there isn't more support to get women and men who want to work in the field out there working in the field. There's a ton of resistance from CAL FIRE and municipal departments. You can actually work for forestry with a record, but it's really hard. And I think that part of that is that reentry is hard. reentry is hard no matter what. Like, that is an epic challenge to try and navigate. And I think that to do it and sort of go straight into a really difficult field. I mean, firefighting is a really tough field to just be a part of in general. I think it's a real challenge. And it's not just that CDCR doesn't provide the cartilage between the program and the jobs. It's also just that societally, you know, like beyond firefighting, we don't have enough support when people are reentering. I think that needs to really, you know, be a huge focus going forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And that is a focus of Community Partners in Action, is reentry work. And so we definitely know, what our women and men are facing when they come home from prison, and our programs are built to try to, really provide all of the services that someone would need to be successful when they come home. So we have several questions in the question box. So I think it's time to bring Jennifer back.
Here I am. Oh, I'm hearing a little echo again. Is everybody okay?
Yeah, that's sort of been going on. There's a little...
Yeah. Oh, Crowdcast. Stop it, please. Well, it seems to subside, though, after a moment. So hopefully everything's good. My goodness, what a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. We do have some great audience questions. I'm going to jump in with one first. So I'm in Connecticut, obviously, here at the Mark Twain House, as is Beth. My son is a professional firefighter in Brattleboro, Vermont. And I'm wondering, are there programs like this in other states other than California?
There are. California actually relies on incarcerated firefighters the most and has probably the most established historically program. But I think, there isn't an exhaustive list of which states actually do use incarcerated firefighters, but I know Oregon, Arizona, maybe Virginia. There's actually an all-female crew in Virginia, and they're the only engine crew for an entire town. And I'm trying to remember the name of the town, and it's lost on me. Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry to put you on the spot with that, but that's fascinating. And in keeping with the point that Beth noticed about that females maybe are a little bit better at some aspects of this than males too. It's fascinating. And all these things we never would think about had you not brought them to light for us, Jamie. So thank you. So audience questions. Tom has been a very active member of our audience tonight, and he cites the 13th Amendment: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. He says, have we evolved far enough from chain gangs? And can you talk about the relationship between maybe chain gangs and these firefighters?
Sure. I think that I mentioned in the book that when you watch a crew working, and I should mention that when they're not active on fires, they are working. They're still out in the community, either, clearing fire roads. They're doing stuff, brush clearance within, sometimes Topanga or Malibu, and that's for obviously Malibu 13. There are other camps that do stuff within the community. So they're out there, whether there's a fire or not, working. So you can see women in these orange jumpsuits with CDCR stamps on the back, and they're like hoeing and raking and throwing brush to the side. And it does resemble a chain gang. And it is a very striking and disturbing visual. And there were several women who, of course, spoke to the dissatisfaction of being paid so little, which, at the time I started my reporting, it was $2.56 a day in camp. and then it was $1 to $2 an hour on the fire line, and now the daily rate has raised to $5. And those wages actually are the highest wages within prison industries in California. So they're plum jobs if you're a prisoner, because you can actually make money. They are still appalling wages compared to civilian crews, and they're doing just as dangerous and just as intense work, and just as backbreaking. And I do think that that clause is, I think it was reintroduced in December to remove the clause from the 13th Amendment. And there's a bill, I think, that is up for a vote now to remove it. And there was a name for it. There is a name for it that I am also blanking on, and I apologize.
But putting you on the spot, Jamie. I'm sorry.
No, I know this, and I am sorry. I feel like my brain is just a little bit smushy right now. But that clause is what makes slavery still legal, actually, in the States. And I think that it's really problematic, because it says that slavery can exist in prisons.
That's huge. Boy, and Mark Twain would certainly have had something to say about that, I have to say. Wow. So thank you for that. I think you addressed this, but Linda wants to know, after their release from incarceration, have any of the women opted to pursue a career in firefighting, and are they prohibited from that career because of their criminal record? Can you just elaborate on that, or talk about that a little bit more, please?
Yeah. So one of the women that I actually profiled, Whitney, she's, they're all extraordinary, and I have deep fondness for all of them, just because I've talked with them so much, and I feel like their lives are pretty amazing. But she was at Malibu, and she paroled. She went back to Massachusetts, and she wasn't sure what she was going to do. She ended up deciding she really wanted to go back to firefighting, and so she took all of the classes she needed to take, and she actually wrote a postcard. You're not supposed to have any contact with the captains or foremen that you worked with, and so she didn't know how to get in touch with anyone for guidance. So she drew a postcard to one of the captains that had trained her at CIW, and he called her back and told her to call a specific person in Tahoe. And she ended up, becoming a Tahoe hotshot, which is one of the hardest positions in firefighting that you can have. Being a hotshot is grueling, and Tahoe is probably the most elite of the hotshots. And that she could do that for a couple reasons. One, it was a federal job, and within forestry and federal, you can actually have a criminal record. You can actually pursue a job. And her, I don't think they call them captains within the hotshot crews, but one of the supervisors had actually also been a previously formerly incarcerated firefighter, and so he really encouraged her to pursue it. And so she did, and her first season was as a hotshot. She ended up on an engine, and then this is her second season as a on a heliTAC crew. And I think it's really challenging, but she did it, and I think that she had a lot of support along the way to be able to do it. And I think it's a lot harder when you don't. But she kind of like kicked butt and did it.
That's amazing. I find it doubly amazing because some people are born knowing they want to be firefighters, but I'm guessing that a lot of these women, that never occurred to them until it was time for them to approach that. So is that the sense that you have?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of women who I think had never been to national parks before, had never been outside, a pretty urban setting. Selena, one of the women that I wrote about, was from MacArthur Park, and when she talked about like the trees and Sequoia and Yosemite and like some of like hearing the wildlife and seeing that, it was clear that she was seeing stuff that like was being on a different world. And I think that was an experience that was pretty impactful to her. And then even being in Malibu was really different. She told me about how she would catch lizards and trade the lizards for like cup of noodles, like 25-cent packages of noodles, and girls would keep the lizards as pets for like, an hour or two and then let them go. But she like loved catching the lizards in Malibu because there weren't lizards in MacArthur Park.
Right. Well, that's fascinating. Gosh, thank you. So this is another question from Tom. He says, Jamie, can you say if any of Newsom's $2 billion, and I'm not sure what that refers to, will be going to fairer pay for the volunteers? Does that make sense to you? Is that a question you can answer?
Are the volunteers speaking of the incarcerated firefighters?
I'm guessing so.
I think so. Okay. I would say first, I wouldn't use the word volunteer necessarily, but I would also say that no, I don't believe any of the $2 billion is going to them. I am interested to see what Newsom will do with this fire camp program, because I am not sure exactly what he's going to do. He closed 8 camps last year, and I think that was largely due to underpopulation, because during the pandemic, there were a lot less crews that could go out. Sure. And I'm curious to see how the program evolves. I think that there is an opportunity for it to evolve, but I haven't heard anything of that. And I don't think that the $2 billion will be going to raising any wages. But I don't know. He could announce it tomorrow.
And have you got any feedback from politicians or legislators? And has anybody said to you that your book might influence their thinking, or it might be too early for that? Your book is brand new, so.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard specific feedback. It's a good question. I do know that bill, AB 2147, was developed and drafted as a result of the article coming out in 2017. And so I do know that reporting did influence the way that the camps were thought about, and creating a little bit better pathway to a position as a firefighter. I think that there's still a little squishiness to it, but it is an improvement.
Well, hope for continued improvement there.
Yeah.
Sandra wants to know, how do the women get selected while in prison to be part of this program to fight the fires?
So they have to basically have a series of, they have to pass a psychological test. CDCR said they have to not have tried to escape. They have to have certain type of crimes, low level. They have to qualify as low level crimes, which, they say nonviolent, but there were several women who told me that, they were like, well, I was convicted of something with a gun and I still was sent to fire camp. And they sort of said that it was flexible as needed. And so that was according to them. And I think that for the most part, it's like you have under a certain amount of time, like I think it's 3 years or less, you can qualify to go to fire camp. You can't have 10 years on your sentence left.
Okay.
So like one of the characters, Marquette, she had to serve a certain amount of time at CIW before she could even qualify to try and go there. But she was actually, working as a trainer at the training facility at the state prison before she then was able to go to fire camp, because she knew she wanted to go to fire camp. She was doing the training and she was part of that. So that's the other part of who gets to go to camp, is you have to pass a physical test and you have to pass a written test. And there's a 3-week training for that. And the physical part of the training is done by trainers who are incarcerated. And many of those trainers just will never be able to qualify for camp. And so they're, and a lot of the materials used to train were like kind of ingenious. They didn't have like weights or anything. They would just fill water bottles with sand and then use that as weights. Oh, wow. And they would, after doing a week of training in the yard, they would go qualify for a gate pass and go out to the hills in Chino and be hiking with the gear, with their Nomexes on, and sort of get into the rhythm of that. And then they had the classroom training. And so once they were able to pass all of that, and there's like a very strenuous physical test, including running a mile under a certain amount of time while you're wearing your pack. And, the amount of physical activity that's required was so intense that I could never do it. It was, maybe I could, but probably not. But they, they would do it, they would qualify, they'd go to camp. And then once they were at camp, they would continue the training. And I think that's how they became and evolved as firefighters, was that then they would be with the foreman and on the crew that they worked with. And that would sort of inform how they became, more adept at becoming firefighters.
So in other firefighting settings, in urban fire departments and rural ones, it's not just fighting fires. People respond to drug overdoses and all kinds of other emergencies. Is this ever part of these firefighters' line of duty, or are they specifically just for these specific fires?
So that's one of the reasons that they can't actually have a job in CAL FIRE or municipal crews, is that for a long time they couldn't qualify to have EMT or EMR licenses, and because they had criminal records. And so they cannot respond to those kinds of calls. Okay. They're strictly wildland firefighters. Okay. It's not like house calls. It's not, though, oftentimes they're working within the community. They are responding to things that happen to people. They're not usually, it's not the typical sort of engine crew.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for that. Emily Fleckenstein has a great question. What's the injury rate while at camp or on fires? And is there any support, such as workers' comp or L&I?
There's not really workers' comp, though I hesitate to say that for sure because I don't know 100% that that's true, but I'm pretty sure that that's true. One of the things I found when I was reading more and more about CDCR and researching it was that they have a pretty appalling health and dental situation that actually was deemed cruel and unusual punishment by the Supreme Court, and it was taken under a conservatorship. It's actually run by an outside company now, a third party, and it still is problematic. There are like leaked documents that sort of expose mental and physical health abuses. And this is the large bureaucracy that is in charge of the health of these firefighters. And so when we're talking about, how they're cared for and whether or not there's any like on-site OSHA inspection, or if there are, if they can, have somebody monitoring the situation and work conditions, like, no, there absolutely is not. However, there really isn't for civilian fire crews either. They're in the middle of the forest and they're working incredibly physically demanding jobs and incredibly mentally demanding jobs. And a lot of that is just starting to really come out, even the kinds of PTSD that firefighters are suffering, just fire after fire after fire because of the climate crisis that's existing right now. and that they're immersed in every day. And, sometimes for 45 days at a time, sometimes longer, with very little break.
And there's also, it's well known that firefighters probably at every tier are at increased risk of cancers and other things.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like there's not a lot of safety net built into the system for that kind of thing either.
Right. And there isn't a lot of follow-up. I mean, because once the formerly incarcerated firefighters are released, it's not like anybody is like asking them 5 years later, how are you doing? Are your lungs doing well? Like, can you breathe? A lot of, like, there was one woman, Lily, who I interviewed, and she really wanted me to know, my back is permanently hurt. Like, I hurt all the time. There are jobs I can't do because I hurt my back carrying this equipment in the middle of a fire. And she did, she also mentioned at the time her foreman was really, kind and generous about it, and like helped her and carried her equipment and was able to care for her. And she didn't have to necessarily hike the same amount. But at the same time, she was doing this job. Her back is permanently altered. Her body is permanently altered. She got out of prison and she can't do certain jobs. And that narrows the field of what reentry is even more.
Wow. So Beth, I have a question for you, and this goes back to my initial question about programs in other states other than California. Are there any kind of similar programs that you, as the head of Community Partners in Action, are aware of for incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people? And is there something in Connecticut where folks do have an opportunity or a challenge to join a firefighting force or other things like that?
So not firefighting, no, but there are opportunities within the Department of Correction that incarcerated people can take advantage of. So, for example, there are college courses and college programs that actually come into the prison. Wesleyan is one, Yale is another, where people who are incarcerated can get involved. If they have their GED or high school diploma, they can earn college credits while incarcerated. There's also vocational training programs. Manufacturing has been brought in to the prisons. And so that's been a good thing because manufacturing jobs are in demand in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. So while, may not be fighting fires, there are opportunities within the Department of Correction in Connecticut where people can gain valuable skills.
That's good. We should support that. Thank
Absolutely.
You. So, Jaime, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit because the bottom line is Mark Twain was a writer, and I always like to say the Mark Twain House is a writer's home and a home for writers. So I want to hear a little bit about your writing career and your writing routine and what you plan to do next.
Okay.
That's a big question.
It is a big question. It's many different parts to it. I guess I'll start with my writing career, which I feel lucky to have. I feel like my biggest success is that I get to be a writer. That feels very fulfilling to me, and also like it's just what I want to do. I started writing. This is a hard question. It's like it's very broad. I guess I started writing in my high school newspaper because I had this amazing journalism teacher, Montserrat Fontes, who was this crazy woman who would stand on the desk and chain smoke, and we had a newspaper, and she was this force. She was a force of nature, and she also wrote books, and I was totally overwhelmed with the idea that you could be a journalist, that you could write fiction, and that you could also be this, absolutely crazy teacher who was wonderful. And we put out a weekly paper, and this was I'm a product of public schools in California and the UC system, and it was an incredible experience. And I went to college and studied art and worked at the newspaper, and then moved to New York and thought, I'm going to try and write. And it was like really hard. It's really obviously hard. I didn't expect to be able to do it. And I feel lucky that I do. And so anyway, so I started out writing about music. I've written about sports. I've written, like, my driving force is that I want to write about people. I want to talk to people. If I'm curious about their lives, I want to know more. That's what I'm interested in. And so that's where I started with Old Dirty Bastard, as that he was this enigmatic rapper, and I wrote about music for The Voice at the time. I did the last interview with him, and I was really struck by the time we spent together, and then I was struck by his death and what that meant. And then I ended up many years later writing Mental, which was the book about bipolar disorder and lithium. And that was much more personal. It's a memoir because I am bipolar and I was taking lithium. And that was a whole other beast because it was sort of writing my experiences, but then also interviewing people. And then this was my next project. And I recently wrote an article that was about homelessness in Venice Beach. And that's something that I might continue working on because it's a topic that I find needs, it doesn't need more attention, but I think it needs more personal and clear stories. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of data, there's a lot of sort of academic thinking about it, but I think that we need to, it feels like a parallel story to mass incarceration in a lot of ways, because I think there are these two populations that exist because of societal changes that happened in the 70s and 80s, and they are populations that need attention and they need help. Like, we need to actually, as a society, recognize that this is a spiritual and humanitarian crisis. And I think that they are kind of twin problems that are existing. One is very visible and one is sort of meant to be invisible in some ways. And I think that they're not really. So I guess I answered what I'm thinking about working on. I answered what my writing life is like, but my routine is pretty haphazard. I can't speak to what it exactly is, especially right now. I feel very all over the place. But I think basically I will get my claws into a story and I start just diving in, and then it's all about sort of deadlines and needing to get the story out. Like, sometimes the story feels much more important and like I just need to push it further.
Well, I think, and this is not obviously original to me, but I think that your impulse to put human faces, human voices, actual human beings in these stories to help us connect with these issues, and not in an impersonal or detached way, but to understand that these are actual people that are being affected and that are part of our communities. I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you.
So Tom says, Jamie, is your agent shopping your book to Hollywood producers? Is an important subject. And that's a good point. I can see it.
It actually, thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. It is actually already optioned. It was optioned when it was an article. And so somehow the people who optioned it had faith that the book would also somehow deliver something. But,
oh, wow.
So it is in the works with 3 production companies, and they're working on it, which is cool.
Oh, wow. Congratulations. Tom, I'm glad you asked that question because that's huge. So you have to come back when we'll do a screening at the Mark Twain House and Museum.
Absolutely.
And Beth will come.
And I'll collect my bobblehead.
Yes, yes.
That's it. That's the one I want. You want the little bobblehead.
You get a bobblehead. For the audience who doesn't get that, usually when we have speakers come speak in person at the Mark Twain House and Museum, at the end of their presentation, I present them with a Mark Twain bobblehead. And we have not been able to do that virtually. But yes, Jamie, you're going to come and gather your bobblehead, and we'll give you a tour of the Mark Twain House. Have you ever been to Hartford?
I haven't. I would love to. No, I haven't. I would love to see the exhibit. Yeah,
Yes.
I want to go to see the exhibit. It sounds amazing.
It is.
And
it'll
great.
run through December, so you have plenty of time.
Good.
Well, we'll
there.
hit you up. So just let us know when you can come. And oh my goodness, what a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Beth, for your wonderful preparation and your great questions. And Jamie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story with us. We're so grateful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you both. I really appreciate it. It was so nice to meet you and so great to talk. Thank you.
You too. You too.
And thank you to our audience. We always hear from speakers that the Mark Twain House audiences always have the best questions, and I think that that has held true tonight. So thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. And visit us at marktwainhouse.org to see what else we have coming up soon. And we look forward to hosting you, Jamie, and seeing you again soon, Beth. Thank you so much.
Got it. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.
And don't forget to buy this book.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
All right. The link is pretty prevalent in the chat. So there you go. Get a signed copy. And
I highly recommend it.
I do too.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.